Somewhere on the Mongolian steppe, in a felt tent that smelled of sheep grease and horse sweat and something vaguely resembling ambition, a Chinese clerk sat cross-legged on a wool blanket and tried to keep his ink from freezing. His brush hovered over a strip of yak hide. The wind pressed against the walls of the jur, making the whole structure breathe like a sleeping animal. Outside, the empire stretched in every direction, an incomprehensible expanse of grassland, mountain, desert, and conquered city. Inside, the clerk recorded grain yields for masters who could not read a single character he wrote. This is the image that history forgot to paint. The popular version of the Mongol Empire is all thunder and teeth. Genghis Khan on horseback, arrows darkening the sky. Cities cracked open like eggs, their populations scattered or slaughtered with the kind of efficiency that makes modern logistics experts quietly uncomfortable. And none of that is wrong, exactly. The Mongols were extraordinarily good at destroying things. World class, really. Historically elite. But destroying things, it turns out, is the easy half of empire. The hard half is what comes after. The taxing, the feeding, the counting, the scheduling, the irrigation, the diplomacy, the mail. The tedious, ink-stained, deeply unglamorous machinery that turns conquered land into functioning territory. And the Mongols, for all their terrifying brilliance on the battlefield, had essentially no idea how any of that worked. They had conquered the most complex civilizations on Earth, Persia, China, Central Asia, and then stood blinking at the paperwork like someone who had just won a hospital in a poker game. Congratulations. You now own a bureaucracy. Please do not burn it down. The survival of the largest contiguous land empire in human history did not depend on the men who conquered it. It depended almost entirely on the captive specialists who kept it running. Persian accountants, Chinese engineers, Muslim astronomers, Uyghur scribes, prisoners, most of them, dragged across continents to sit in felt tents and build a government for people who regarded written language with mild suspicion. The empire belonged to the sword, supposedly. But the sword could not count grain. And grain, as it turns out, is what empires actually run on. To be fair to the Mongols, they were astonishingly good at the thing they were good at. Their cavalry tactics were not simply effective. They were a revelation. Mongol warriors could ride for days without stopping, sleeping in the saddle, eating dried meat and curd paste while covering distances that would have taken European armies weeks. They feigned retreats that lured enemies into kill zones. They coordinated flanking maneuvers across miles of open terrain using flag signals and smoke. They adapted siege technology from every culture they encountered, learning Chinese gunpowder techniques and Persian wall-breaking methods and incorporating them into an already devastating toolkit. The psychological warfare was almost worse than the physical kind. Cities that surrendered were spared. Cities that resisted were annihilated so thoroughly that the ruins served as warnings for the next city down the road. The Mongols understood branding centuries before anyone had a word for it. Their brand was, comply or become a cautionary tale. But here is the problem with being extraordinarily talented at destruction. Eventually, there is nothing left to destroy, and someone has to figure out what to do with all the empty space. The fall of Khwarezmia is the perfect case study. Shah Muhammad II made the catastrophic decision to execute Mongol trade envoys, which is a bit like slapping a hornet's nest and then standing underneath it with your mouth open. Genghis Khan's response was total war on a scale the region had never experienced. Cities that had thrived for centuries, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, Merv, were systematically besieged, sacked, and in some cases razed to bare earth. The irrigation systems that had sustained Central Asian agriculture for generations were destroyed. Not strategically. Accidentally, mostly. Mongol soldiers simply did not understand what those channels were for. Granaries burned because no one thought to check what was inside before lighting the fire. Artisans who could have rebuilt the cities were executed alongside soldiers because the sorting process was, shall we say, underfunded. The result was a conqueror standing in the middle of an empire-sized ruin. The markets were silent. The canals were dry. The fields were ash. The irrigation ditches filled slowly with sand and wind-blown dust, the faint smell of char still clinging to the clay. The Mongols had won everything and could administer none of it. Winning, it turned out, was the easy part. The hard part was Monday morning. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the paintings of Mongol glory. At the time of Genghis Khan's rise, the Mongol people had no written language of governance. None. No tax code. No census tradition. No filing system. No ledgers. The concept of recording a grain yield on a physical medium and then storing that medium for future reference was, in the most literal sense, foreign to them. It belonged to other civilizations. The ones they were busy conquering. This was not stupidity. It is important to be clear about that. Nomadic steppe life was a profoundly sophisticated system of survival. Managing herds across seasonal pastures required intimate knowledge of grassland ecology, weather patterns, animal husbandry, and kinship diplomacy. A Mongol herder could read a landscape the way a Chinese bureaucrat could read a balance sheet, with precision, nuance, and generations of accumulated expertise. But that expertise did not scale to cities. Genghis Khan understood law. His great legal code, the Yasa, governed everything from hunting protocols to military discipline to the punishment for urinating and running water, which was death, because the steppe takes its water seriously. But the Yasa was oral tradition. When it was finally written down, it had to be transcribed using the Uyghur script, borrowed from a conquered Turkish people, because the Mongols did not have their own. Let that settle for a moment. The largest land empire in history wrote its founding legal document in someone else's alphabet. Taxation? A mystery. Currency? Other people's problem. Urban water management? Completely outside the nomadic frame of reference. Census taking, that foundational tool of every sedentary empire, required concepts of fixed addresses and permanent populations that simply did not exist in a world where home moved with the seasons. The limiting factor of the Mongol Empire was never military. They could take any city on Earth. The limiting factor was that once they took it, nobody in the tent could read the mail. Now layer another problem on top of the literacy gap, because empire building is generous that way. It always has another problem. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, stretched from the Pacific coast of Korea to the borders of Poland. From the frozen taiga of Siberia to the humid river deltas of southern China. From the high desert plateaus of Persia to the forested river systems of Rus. It contained rice paddies and reindeer herders, silk workshops and yak caravans, oasis cities sustained by underground canal systems called khanats, and fishing villages on rivers so wide they looked like slow-moving seas. Each of these places required entirely different knowledge to govern. Irrigation in Persia, for instance, depended on a network of gently sloping underground tunnels that had been designed, maintained, and repaired by specialized engineers over centuries. The moisture in those tunnels had a particular coolness to it, a mineral dampness that smelled of deep earth and clay. Destroying a Khanate took an afternoon. Rebuilding one took a generation, and only if someone still alive remembered how. Meanwhile, flood management along the Yellow River in China was a completely different discipline, involving dike construction, seasonal monitoring, and a bureaucratic apparatus so vast that it employed tens of thousands of people in normal years. The river smelled of silt and rot and green growing things, and it would kill entire provinces if someone miscalculated a levee height by the width of a hand. Tax collection in a settled agricultural society, where farmers grew wheat on fixed plots and could be reliably assessed each harvest, bore absolutely no resemblance to extracting tribute from semi-nomadic forest peoples who traded in furs and amber and had a relationship with fixed authority that could generously be described as optional. The empire did not face one administrative problem. It faced dozens, simultaneously, scattered across climate zones, languages, writing systems, legal traditions, and economic models that had never been connected before and had no particular interest in cooperating now. One set of rulers, one military tradition, and 1,000 different answers to the question of how civilizations actually function, none of which the Mongols possessed. So they went looking for people who did. This is the heart of it, the part the legends leave out. When the Mongol armies swept through a city, the killing was not random. Or rather, it started random and then became terrifyingly organized. After the initial slaughter, soldiers sorted survivors the way a farmer sorts seeds. Warriors were conscripted or executed. General populations were enslaved, scattered, or occasionally released. But skilled workers, artisans, engineers, scribes, doctors, astronomers, tax collectors, anyone with a demonstrably useful skill were separated, cataloged, and marched east. Marched is a gentle word for it. These were forced relocations across thousands of miles of steppe and desert on foot or in carts, in heat and in cold that cracked skin and froze eyelashes together. The smell of the journey was unwashed wool, animal dung fuel, and the faintly metallic tang of exhaustion. Many did not survive the trip. Those who did arrived at Karakoram, the Mongol capital, a city of felt tents and wooden buildings in the middle of a grassland so vast it made the sky feel like a weight. And there, in that surreal and wind-bitten place, they were put to work. Persian tax collectors from the family networks that would eventually produce Rashid al-Din, the great vizier and historian of the Ilkhanate, found themselves calculating livestock assessments for Mongol princes who had never seen a ledger. Chinese engineers who understood siege mechanics and canal construction were set to building infrastructure in a place that had never needed infrastructure before. Muslim astronomers and mathematicians were brought to chart the heavens and calculate calendars, because even an empire that distrusted writing understood that someone had to know when to plant and when to ride. Uyghur scribes became the empire's first literate administrative class almost by accident. They could write. The Mongols could not. So the Uyghurs wrote, and in doing so became indispensable in that quiet, permanent way that people who handle the paperwork always become indispensable. The scene inside the administrative tents at Karakoram defied every expectation. Felt walls muffled the steppe wind. Yak hide ledgers lay stacked in corners, their surfaces smooth and faintly oily, covered in scripts from 4 or 5 different languages. A Persian accountant sat next to a Chinese engineer sat next to a Uyghur scribe, none of them speaking the same mother tongue, all of them working for an empire that had kidnapped them. The air smelled of ink, tallow candles, and the animal skin parchment that served as the empire's memory. The silence in those tents was the strangest part. Outside, the Mongol Empire was a thing of horses and shouting and the drum of hooves on frozen ground. Inside, it was the soft scratch of brush on hide. The quiet, meticulous labor of captive men building a government for their captors. History's most violent conquerors survived on the ink-stained fingers of prisoners. Every arrow in the quiver, every garrison fed, every canal maintained, every tax assessed, passed through the hands of people who had been dragged from their burning cities and told to make the math work. And they did, because the alternative was considerably worse. Here is a fact that gets repeated often and understood rarely. The Mongol Empire was remarkably tolerant of religious diversity. Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Taoists, Confucians, shamanists, and a scattering of traditions that don't fit neatly into any modern category all coexisted under Mongol rule. Karakoram had mosques and churches and temples within walking distance of each other. Foreign travelers marveled at it. Modern historians cite it as evidence of Mongol cosmopolitanism. And it was cosmopolitan. Genuinely. The diversity was real, the coexistence was real, and the cultural exchange that resulted produced some of the most remarkable intellectual cross-pollination in pre-modern history. But the motivation was not enlightenment. The motivation was that the Mongols could not afford to be picky. When the entire administrative apparatus of an empire is built from kidnapped specialists, ideological purity becomes a luxury. A Muslim astronomer who can calculate planting seasons is more valuable than a Mongol warrior who cannot, regardless of what either of them believes about the nature of the divine. A Nestorian Christian physician who can treat the Khan's gout is not going to be turned away because of a theological disagreement. A Chinese Confucian bureaucrat who understands census methodology is going to be employed, full stop, because nobody else in the tent can do what he does. Tolerance, in the Mongol context, was a resource extraction strategy. It meant, we will not interfere with your soul because we need your skills. Worship as you please. Pray in any direction. Observe any fast, celebrate any feast. But the tax records are due by autumn, and the canal survey must be completed before the spring melt. And if those deadlines are not met, tolerance has its limits. The result was one of history's most genuinely diverse workplaces, staffed almost entirely by people who had not volunteered for the position. Free to believe anything. Free to practice any faith. Not free to leave. It was progressive and coercive at the same time, which is an uncomfortable combination that history produces more often than anyone likes to admit. Even with a kidnapped bureaucracy humming along in the felt tent ministries, the Mongol Empire faced a problem that no amount of captured expertise could fully solve: time itself. Nomadic life runs on a seasonal clock. Herds move to summer pastures. Herds move to winter pastures. Mares foal in spring, and the fermented mare's milk called arag flows in summer, and the rhythm of life bends around grass and weather and the ancient, non-negotiable needs of animals. Mongol governance inherited this rhythm. The Kurult AI, the great assembly where khans were elected and major decisions made, could only convene when enough leaders had physically gathered in one place, which meant riding, sometimes for months, across the steppe. The smell of those gatherings was legendary, a rich, complicated fog of horse, leather, fermented milk, roasted meat, and unwashed greatness. Now overlay the administrative calendars of every conquered civilization. Chinese agriculture required precise planting and harvest schedules tied to lunar and solar calculations. Persian irrigation demanded canal maintenance timed to snowmelt in distant mountains. Russian tribute collection followed fur trapping seasons that had nothing to do with anything happening on the steppe. The result was a constant, grinding friction between nomadic time and sedentary time. A succession crisis could last years, not because anyone was indecisive, but because physically assembling the relevant decision-makers required crossing a continent on horseback. Orders issued in Karakoram took months to reach provincial governors. By the time a response arrived, the situation had changed entirely. The Mongol answer to this problem was the yam, a relay postal system of extraordinary ambition. Stations were built every 25 to 30 miles along major routes, stocked with fresh horses, food, and riders. Messages could cross the empire in days instead of months. Marco Polo, who was impressed by very little, was impressed by the yam. But here is the detail that completes the pattern. The relay stations were built and staffed largely by conscripted locals. The horses were requisitioned from conquered populations. The roads were maintained by forced labor. The empire's greatest innovation in communication, the system that compressed steppe distances into something approaching manageable, ran on the same fuel as everything else: the labor of people who had not been asked. Every system built on borrowed expertise contains its own expiration date. The Mongol Empire found this out slowly, then all at once. The fracture began, as imperial fractures usually do, with succession. Genghis Khan divided his empire among his sons and grandsons, which is a time-honored method of ensuring that everyone fights about everything forever. Within 2 generations, the unified empire had splintered into 4 major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Shagat-Ai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Golden Horde in the Western Steppe and Russia. Each maintained the fiction of a shared Mongol identity. Each increasingly operated as an independent state. And in each, the same quiet process unfolded. The administrators, those kidnapped, coerced, and grudgingly retained specialists, did not simply maintain the systems they had been forced to build. They shaped them. They influenced them. They slowly, steadily became the systems themselves. In China, Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty and attempted to rule in the Chinese imperial tradition. He built a capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, and surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, Confucian scholars, and a bureaucratic apparatus modeled on previous Chinese dynasties. The felt tents gave way to tiled roofs. The yak hide ledgers gave way to silk paper records. The smell of the court shifted from animal grease to sandalwood incense. Mongol rulers learned Chinese customs, adopted Chinese administrative practices, and within a few generations had become, in almost every functional sense, a Chinese dynasty with Mongol ancestry. The clerks had not just maintained the system. They had absorbed their conquerors into it. In Persia, the pattern was even more striking. The Ilkhanate rulers, descended from Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, initially maintained their nomadic identity with fierce pride. But governing Persia required Persian administrators, Persian tax systems, Persian irrigation expertise, and increasingly, Persian cultural norms. Ghazan Khan converted to Islam in 1295. It was not a spiritual awakening. It was an administrative surrender. The Mongol rulers of Persia became Persian, not because Persia conquered them militarily, but because the people who actually ran the empire had been Persian all along. The Golden Horde dissolved more gradually, its Mongol identity blurring into the Turkic cultures of the Western Steppe and the Slavic populations of the Russian principalities. The tribute system persisted for centuries, but the people collecting the tribute and the people paying it slowly merged until the distinction between conqueror and conquered became largely ceremonial. In every case, the same quiet revolution played out. The warriors aged. The warriors' grandchildren grew soft or assimilated or quarreled themselves into irrelevance. But the administrators endured. The census takers, the canal engineers, the tax assessors, the scribes, they kept showing up. They kept the ink wet and the ledgers current and the grain counted. And when the empire finally crumbled, they were still there, running things for whoever came next. The Mongol Empire did not fall to armies. It dissolved, gently, into the administrative cultures of the people it had conquered. The clerks outlasted the khans. The ink outlasted the arrows. And the systems, those tedious, essential, unglamorous systems, simply continued under new management. There is a pattern here that reaches well beyond the 13th century. Every revolutionary force that promises to tear down the existing system eventually discovers, with varying degrees of embarrassment, that it needs the existing system to function. The Bolsheviks purged the Tsarist bureaucracy and then quietly rehired large portions of it because someone had to keep the trains running. Post-colonial governments across Africa and Asia retained colonial administrative structures, not out of admiration, but because the alternative was starting from scratch in a world that would not wait. Tech companies that built their brands on disrupting traditional industries now employ vast armies of consultants, lawyers, accountants, and middle managers who are functionally the same bureaucratic class that has kept institutions running since Sumer invented the receipt. The conquerors always need the clerks. Always. Without exception. Because conquest is a moment, but governance is a calendar, and calendars require people who understand how systems work. The Mongols are simply the most dramatic illustration of this rule. They conquered half the known world with speed and violence that still startles historians. And then they discovered and felt tense on a windswept steppe that the sword means nothing without the ledger. That terror fades, but taxes are forever. That the people who know how things actually work are always quietly the ones who hold the real power, even when they are prisoners, even when they are ignored, even when the glory goes to someone on a horse. Return, one last time, to that felt tent on the Mongolian steppe. The wind still presses against the walls. The candle still flickers. The Chinese clerk still sits cross-legged on his wool blanket, brush moving steadily across yak hide, recording grain yields in characters his masters cannot read. He was captured. He was marched across a continent. He was put to work by people who burned his city and killed people he knew. And yet his brush moves. The ink, warmed by his own breath so it will not freeze, flows in clean, precise strokes. The record he keeps will outlast the Khan who ordered it. the system he maintains will absorb the empire that enslaved him. The warriors are forgotten. The battles blur together. The empires rise and crack and crumble into the grass. But the ink dries, and the record holds, and the clerk's work remains. Because it was never the sword that held the world together. It was the quiet, stubborn, ink-stained hand that wrote it all down.